Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben DuBose here, Paulo, Alves there. Welcome into another podcast episode of The Locker Line. It's now Thursday, May 8th. We're 4 days removed from the end of the 2025 Houston Rockets playoff run. I had a mini episode in the hours after Game 7 offering some immediate reactionary takes to that brutal home Game 7 loss in the first round to the hated Golden State Warriors. Now, as promised a few days later, I've got Paulo with me, and we're going to do some bigger picture deep dive analysis on what we really learned from that playoff series, along with something of a preview for the upcoming off season. We won't get to everything today. We're going to have an episode early next week after the draft lottery on Monday night. We'll see if the Rockets get lucky and defy the odds yet again and moving up into the top four. They have about a 17.5% chance of doing so with that pick from the Phoenix Suns, which enters at 9th in the odds order. So we'll see how things go on Monday. And when we have our post-lottery show reacting to that, we'll also tie in some additional off-season themes then. Today, we're going to be largely focusing on the Warriors series. And I'll start with what I think is so frustrating and so fitting. How #Houston Sports is it that one game after Game 7, Steph Curry blows out his hamstring and is out for at least a week to 10 days, probably more than that if you dig into the history of hamstring recoveries. How incredibly fitting is it, Paulo, that one game too late, that's when Steph Curry's hamstring blows? And it's some other team that's probably reaping the rewards of Amen Thompson and Dylan Brooks forcing Steph Curry to work so hard over those 7 games.
Not only that, I think I read somewhere that it's his first muscle strain type injury, right? I think he's had ankle problems obviously early in his career, but I read somewhere it's his first this type of injury, muscle tissue type. So they're not sure how he'll recover from it. So they're having more trouble getting a timeline on. But I don't know what you said about the Houston Sports thing. Listen, in my quest to live a happier, less toxic life, I try to think about those types of things the least that I possibly can. Is it unfortunate? Yeah. Is it 100% related to having played such a physical series beforehand? 100%. That being said, and I'm like this with all my sports teams, which there are a lot of. Once we are knocked out, I tune out of basically everything that goes on from that competition from that moment forward. Obviously, I still love basketball, but I'm mostly watching Eastern Conference right now. That's how I deal with the drama. That being said, I can't lie that even though this sounds a little bit counterintuitive, I'd rather the Warriors win that series, and I'd rather the Warriors go as far as they can because of what that says about us, especially if they dominate the Wolves.
I know there are people inside the building at Toyota Center that are having a tough time watching this series because they saw how much Minnesota struggled in Game 1 against Golden State's zone, and they're thinking of how the Timberwolves would have likely performed against the double big zone led by Steven Adams and Alperen Şengün. The Rockets really like that matchup and the potential of getting to the Western Conference Finals had they had just won one more game against the Warriors. And so to see it go down like this, where you thought there was a clear weakness for Minnesota, it's playing out that way. Even after the Warriors lost Steph Curry, by the way, Brian Windhorst had the stat, in that Game 7 against the Rockets, Steph Curry ran 1.99 miles. That's the most he's ever run in a game in his NBA career. So the Rockets really did put him through the ringer, and now it's the Timberwolves that theoretically should reap the rewards, but to this point they have not because they couldn't score on the Warriors. And so along the same lines as what you were saying, Paulo, I'm curious your perspective on if this continues, and again, we're just one game into that series, and we'll see how Golden State holds up, especially offensively. Without Steph Curry, they're going to have to ask Jimmy Butler to do more. But if, hypothetically, this level of defense sustains itself, because I think we can both agree Steph Curry is not fundamental to what they're doing defensively. If they suffocate the Warriors, if they suffocate the Timberwolves, if Anthony Edwards never gets going, does it maybe make you feel a little bit differently about how that first round series went? Or are you just mad no matter what because the Rockets had their chances and couldn't get it done?
I'd have to say, I'd have to kind of see and actually go and watch the games and see how Anthony Edwards is getting shut down. Like, is he struggling with ball pressure? Like, I'm full disclosure, I have not watched game one. Is he struggling because of ball pressure? Because that's what got Kevin struggling. Kevin could not get past the first line of defense. There were a couple plays here and there where he'd get to the rim and he'd get blocked, but, with Jalen, it's about getting, or at least for the series, was about getting through that first level of on-ball pressure. And then it was about, there's no in-between game. The best thing for Jalen's career, and I've been saying this for a while, would be getting a floater game going because, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's lack of strength. I don't know if he doesn't, I think it's a combination of things, but obviously lack of strength. It's obviously his positioning, him trying to finish around guys, him not trying to bump shot blockers off of their spots, speed's not going to get you through your NBA career. You're really fast. Everybody's really athletic here. And so a floater game will obviously solve a lot of that, but without getting too much into it, it would make me feel a little better. But at the same time, I guarantee you that if I go and watch the rest of the series, that Ant is going to, at the very least, be able to get shots up. And that's something that for the regular season, I defended Jalen for, because I was like, yeah, he's not really making shots at that bit of a rate, depending on the part of the season that you're talking about. But he's our only guy on the perimeter that can generate a shot. Even if it's a step back three, he can generate a shot. It felt like in this Warriors series, he couldn't even do that. There were times where, and as I'm sure you guys can remember, during the regular season, last possession of the first half, Jalen gets the ball because he's the only guy we can guarantee gets a shot. We weren't able to do that against the Warriors, and the couple of times that we did, one of them he got blocked, and it was just all over the place. And so the Warriors don't have these amazing on-ball defense guys that other teams, they have good on-ball defense, but other teams have guys that are the same, that have guarded Jalen. So yeah, from my perspective, it would make me feel a little bit better, but it more than likely would not sway me on the overarching theme of what Jalen has been this postseason.
Yeah, I think I agree. And that leads into our primary discussion for today's pod, which is going to be stock up, stock down, and let's call it hold, stock neutral. Guys who didn't move the needle either way in your assessment of them long term based on how they played in the playoffs against the Warriors. I'm going to go through all 8 rotation players, the 5 starters plus Steven Adams, Tari Eason, Jabari Smith Jr. off the bench, and Ime Udoka as head coach. We're not going to do it all at once because we want to let this breathe, have a little bit of back and forth. And I'm going to start our discussion with the guy that Paulo's been talking about the last few minutes, which is Jalen Green, because I think he's the player who everyone, both of us and anyone listening to this pod, if you don't have him as stock down at least a little bit, you have to be kidding yourself. You're not being serious. And I'm not out on Jalen Green. I'm not selling all my stock, but it is fair to say that this was a disappointing series, especially because once they took away plan A for him, that initial ball pressure, as you said, there was no plan B. There were no counters. And so that's what makes it really, really frustrating. And he's not done developing. He's 23 years old. He'll still be 23 when the season starts in the fall. So no, he's not a finished product. It's going to be a very important offseason for him. But what's frustrating is that the inconsistency that even since in the second half of last season, he started being on an upward trajectory. It hasn't necessarily been sustained those peaks because it feels like at some point other teams commit a few more resources to him and then it goes back down. And this was just more of the same. I'll start my analysis. Let's look at the stats. He was the leading scorer for the season, 21 a game, 54.5% true shooting. The playoffs, he was your 4th leading scorer, 13.3 points, 48% true shooting, below 40% from the field, 30% from three, 70% on free throws, just ugly across the board. Now, you can point out he was actually the third highest rated Rockets player. When you look at on and off court data, net ratings, Jalen was actually plus 5.6. But, and I'm sure we'll touch on a few times things that were said by Rafael Stone and Ime Udoka at the end of season press conference. You can't argue that the lineup data is flawed in the regular season, which a lot of it suggests that the Rockets were better without Jalen Green. I think there are some mitigating circumstances there, but you can't then turn around and point to the net rating in the playoffs and say, well, we're going to give him a blank check and ignore these numbers because he was the third highest rated Rocket. No, that's not how it works. If we're going to note context in the regular season and say there's some extenuating circumstances, then there's probably some extenuating circumstances to those on-court, off-court differentials and net ratings in the playoffs as well. I think, by and large, you have to look at the numbers, just trust what your eyes tell you, and he was not good in this series. And another argument I want to deconstruct off the top, some will undoubtedly say, didn't the Warriors commit to taking him out of this series? Doesn't that show you what they think of him? Not necessarily. I don't think the Rockets or the Warriors tried to take Jalen Green out of this series, as Draymond Green put it, because they viewed him as the Rockets' best player. I think they did that because he might be the most indispensable in the standpoint of there's no one else that can do what he does when he's at his best. And so if you take away that gear, that upside, there's not someone you can slide into that role. And bottom line, they're probably not going to score enough in the half court to win 4 times out of 7. So no, because the Warriors committed those resources to him, that doesn't mean they're viewing him as a star or as the best player in the Rockets. No, what it means is that they don't think the Rockets have a pathway to win the series if Jalen doesn't get going. And so that's why they played it that way. It's not necessarily a huge endorsement of how good Jalen is overall. It's more an issue of roster construction and that Houston just doesn't have many alternatives, if any, that Ime Udoka can reasonably turn to. I think at this point, the Cam Whitmore ship, at least for this season, has largely sailed. So when we talk about all these qualifiers of roster construction, and yeah, you know, maybe there's less ball pressure if there's someone else among those other 4 that can do more from a shot creation or shooting standpoint. Maybe, but if we're constantly adding these ifs when it comes to, you know, the lineups around him, how teams choose to defend him, that's not a star player or anything close. If it's as easy to take a quote-unquote leading scorer out of a game as what the Warriors did to Jalen Green, it would happen all the time. If all you had to do was add a little bit of ball pressure and hedge from time to time, and you could take a 20-something points per game scorer and drop him to 13 a game on terrible efficiency, this would happen all the time in the playoffs, where teams are dialing up player-specific game plans all over the league. It doesn't happen that way. And Paulo, I think it gets into exactly what you said, which is that there aren't enough counters. With Jalen, he's gotten better at a few skills. You know, the three-point shooting, starting Thanksgiving Eve, the final 63 games of this season. People talk about how he had a career-high clip from 3 this year, but since Thanksgiving Eve, the final 63 games, shooting over 8 threes per game, high volume, he was above 37%. That's pretty damn good. He's worked at the threes. He's gotten better defensively. So this is not someone that isn't trying. He's made clear strides. He has gotten better. He's coachable. There's a reason why the Rockets stand by him. But that's also why I struggle to sort of, you know, some people, when you bring up the mid-range game or the floaters, will say, oh, he grades out terribly in these areas by the percentages. Well, it's so small, he so rarely does it. What I'm curious about is, can he get better if he actually tries? Because you can't convince me that if he's shooting 37% on threes at high volume, high difficulty step backs, that this guy doesn't have the touch to convert from the mid-range or develop a floater the way James Harden did. Speaking of James Harden, I said this on the Post Game 7 pod. It feels like in a lot of ways, watching Jalen Green in that series was like watching a poor man's version of James Harden, in that it was very predictable, and yet, unlike James, there weren't the additional gears when it comes to playmaking. Jalen isn't as strong or crafty when it comes to finishing near the rim. it just felt like in that series, he would take a couple of threes early, and if those didn't fall, he'd be hell-bent on getting to the rim at all costs, and he's typically not strong enough to finish through contact. He's less likely to get fouls called in the playoffs. Also, on the rare occasions he did, he made free throws less. And veterans like Draymond and Kevon Looney are much more focused in the playoffs at being disciplined, going vertical. He's not strong enough, Jalen that is, to absorb a little bit of contact. So many times you have 5-on-4s because he goes down. And next thing you know, he gets tentative because he knows the net effect. He knows it's another bad game, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas the really good players, and let's look at his position, look at Devin Booker, look at Donovan Mitchell, they can score at almost any spot on the court inside of 25 feet. With Jalen, it's not that. It's very predictable. And so with a very predictable Jalen Green, who's only going to fire from a couple areas, especially when he's used in a lineup that has at least 2 non-spacers with Alperen Şengün and Amin Thompson, sometimes 3 if you're going double big and Steven Adams is out there as well, it does not take much at all for your offense to bog down. And so, again, it's not that you should be out on Jalen Green. There is still time. He can learn from this, just as he's made strides defensively and from three-point range. I really think if he works on it, he can develop some of these counters. But at some point, he's got to put up or shut up. Because the line between, with his player archetype, a little undersized for his position, he's not really a big-time playmaker. He's a better defender, but he's certainly not an elite one. I know Jalen and some of his fans bristle at the notion of him being a sixth man, but the reason that criticism gets put out there is because the line is very thin with a player of his archetype between being the tip of the spear A1 scorer that you need, a Donovan Mitchell type, and someone who's probably best suited to be a sixth man because he just doesn't provide enough value in other areas to offset the limitations he has as a good but not great scorer. And, that's one of many reasons. The worst, I do support keeping Jalen Green on this roster unless there's a clear upgrade for a star that you believe fits the timeline. If nothing else, I think Jalen Green would be a very good sixth man. I think if you simplified his role, made it consistent in terms of who and how he attacks, using his energy and burst against second units or guys on the first teams that are a little bit worn down, I think worst case, in a couple of years, he'd be great in that role. No, I'm not saying he's necessarily going to be that. There's still a path where he can be a ton better. But the leash is not unlimited anymore. This is the end of year 4. We're going into year 5. He's going to turn 24 during next season. At some point, he's got to develop counters if his role needs to be this simple. And if there are all these qualifiers, those are the guys that end up being six-man types because it's much easier to keep them in that simplified structure and give them the advantages they need. If you're a starter going up against the best of the best and you're not providing a ton of value in other areas, and again, that's not Jalen's fault, that's just his player archetype, you've got to be really good as a scorer, and that means being able to do it in more ways than he currently can. I'm not out on him because, again, just as we've seen growth defensively and on threes the last couple of years, I don't see any reason why, if he puts his head down and works, that he can't develop more of a mid-range game, a floater game. I can't tell you that it's for sure going to work, but again, I'm also just saying I wouldn't say that it can't. And so with that in mind, I wouldn't move him just to move him. But we do, after this series, sort of have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that there are still clear deficiencies. And honestly, I don't think there's anything necessarily new from the playoffs. I think we saw this in the regular season as well. It felt like anytime he had a sustained stretch of hot play, he would come back to earth. And I think it's a lot of the same dynamic. People would realize just how electric the Rockets can be when Jalen is allowed to be that version, especially in the context of this particular roster. So they'd commit a few more resources, and next thing you know, he turns back into this version. By the way, we're keeping all of our analysis to the playoffs because we've got 5 months without Houston Rockets basketball. So there are other things we can talk about with Jalen and other players, but trying to focus primarily on the Warriors series here because that's what we just watched the last couple of weeks. As far as the season as a whole, we've got 5 months of non-Rockets basketball, unfortunately, in which we can do deeper dives and look further back. I just think as far as to bring my rant to a close, there just simply were not any counters. It was very predictable against the Warriors. And if you are a shooting guard that doesn't provide much value based on your player archetype, your size, and whatnot, it's tough to see a long-term world if this is the peak version of Jalen Green, where he can be a starter on a championship level team. That's not me saying, again, that this is definitively the peak Jalen Green. There's still time. I do think there are areas where he can clearly improve, but this is the end of year 4. This is not the end of year 2, year 3, where we just sort of give a blank check and say, yeah, he's going to work in the offseason and get better. I hope he does, but there are players who start to stagnate around this point, entering their mid-20s. I hope that's not the case with Jalen. I know he has a good mental makeup. I know he works hard. So I'm keeping hope alive, but it would be foolish not to look at this series and say stock down. It's not the end of the road. You don't have to be all the way out on him, but it would be silly to rule it anything other than stock down, right?
So I have a working hypothesis here, and this is like overall Jalen talk. It's obviously stock down for me. It's so much stock. Like, to me, him wanting to see how he performs in the playoffs was a big reason why I was so willing to go through the ups and downs in the regular season. Like, he definitely had a better regular season. Not talking about that. But why I tried to stay off of the hot takes when he wasn't doing well. And it's because he just felt like the type of guy that in the postseason, you don't have any other perimeter creators. This guy can really shine, right? And if he has another year in the postseason, if he has that mentality that all of these shooting guards have, I mean, it's not just Kobe. You can go, and Edwards has that. Donovan Mitchell has that. Devin Booker has that. These are all guys that in the playoffs, they are shooting guards, right? And in the playoffs, the game slows down. This is your time to shine, right? Go get a bucket. Even if you don't have to be as efficient as you are as you need to be in the regular season, game slows down, everybody's efficiency drops. But these guys get it done, right? It was just the complete opposite. He was all right being taken out of games, and I know some of that comes from the coaching staff, but he didn't try to fight through it, even in times where it was very apparent that we needed him to fight through it. And then when it comes to Jalen just in general, I don't think replacing him would be as easy as a lot of people think it is, just because Ime has shown like we have better offensive options or guys that are close enough as offensive options that they would deserve a shout in the rotation in the playoffs that didn't even get it. And I think that's because Ime is just not willing to compromise at all on defense. And yes, Jalen had some times when he fell asleep, gave up offensive rebounds, gave up cutters, mental lapses. But the Rockets were still really good defensively in the playoffs, and Jalen was a part of that, right? He had the ball pressure on Curry. He chased them around. He was fighting through screens. He was doing all that. Like, he was hustling. Like, he had those mental breakdowns, but I don't think there was lack of desire or anything like that. And so whoever you bring into Jalen's role has to be able to at least match that defensively on a game-to-game basis. And I think that's something that you can take away from Jalen, is that he works hard, right? And so obviously Devin Booker can get to that level. Donovan Mitchell can get to that level. But I really like a guy like Colin Sexton, right? If you go get a guy like Colin Sexton, I'm not sure he's going to meet the standards for him to even play him. That's why it's kind of hard, because yes, I do think that he's by far the easiest position to upgrade at this point. But it's hard to find an attainable solution other than the tickety top guys, because guys that are a little bit below him, they have to, or that are better scorers, I mean, that are a little bit above him, that are better scorers, they have to bring that same level of intensity for him to even consider them. And obviously, it has to be a big delta for the Rockets to be willing to part with Jalen, to part with a guy they drafted number 2. It has to be a big enough delta. And that delta with most of these guys is kind of reduced by that fact. It's actually kind of wild that what's in my mind might save Jalen is his work ethic and perhaps his effort on defense at this point. Just because of how kind of rare that is amongst shooting guards. Now, I'm not defending Jalen. I think he had a terrible postseason. I think it's what you said. It's about having counters, and it's about, like, this guy has all the talent in the world. This guy has all the athleticism in the world. Like, He is both bouncy and quick, and his handle has gotten better. I don't think it's kind of hurting him anymore. And it gets to the point where it's just about counters and knowing what to do and manipulating defenses, and he's terrible at it. And that goes into a bit of a larger point that I'm going to try to make quick because it's kind of not the pot to do it. But that generation of players that both caught the AAU like style upbringing, I guess, and at the same time went through COVID. There's a general, and it took a lot of work for me to kind of grind down an argument about this. You look at his draft class, and a lot of guys have the exact same issues, but either have smaller roles so they're not exposed.
Kuminga has
Or-
similar issues.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You look through the draft class. Obviously, Cade is insane, right? Cade's just a one-off. He was always a probably a generational prospect.
Ever since his senior year of high school, yeah, he broke into that elite tier. Yeah, and certainly his 1 year at Oklahoma State. Yeah.
So, well, what I mean is there's clear development gaps in all of these guys. All of these guys lack that middle in between, like the really skill game, like that manipulated defender, that those little nuances that guys get as they have more and more time playing against competition that they aren't just clearly superior athletically against. For example, Jalen obviously has it. That's who we're talking about. Evan Mobley doesn't have that role with the Cavs, and so has been able to not be exposed and slowly work on that game. And nowadays, he is, I think, a reliable offensive player in the role that he has. And he has that middle game, that skill. You look at Jalen Suggs, the exact same thing. Guys pick top 4, he cannot finish at the rim. He doesn't really have like that craftiness. I think craftiness is the perfect word for this. Suggs,
It is, although in Jalen's case, it's also a little bit of strength. Maybe he can work on that as well. But I do think it's a little bit more craft at this point.
yeah, Kuminga,
Because he has bulked up some. Like, he can get stronger, but he's not as light as he was when he was like a rookie or second year guy. He has put some priority on the weight room already, which is what makes me think that while certainly he can get a little bit stronger, most of it is just craft.
Yeah, and craft is a combination of things, obviously. It's your counters, it's your footwork in tight spaces, it's deceleration, it's your touch on shots that are just, I guess the good word for this is shots that are off schedule, right? That you're improvising on. Like Jalen he has the touch, but it always feels like such a last resort that he's not doing it in any type of rhythm, and so it kills it all. Obviously, Bouknight was a shooting guard, completely fell off the map. It was never good enough. Primo, the same thing. Moody has been in a smaller role and has slowly developed a little bit of that game, and we saw at times when he was playing for the Warriors that he had some takeover moments that weren't just shooting or layups. But he was able to bring that up slowly. Trey Murphy was able to bring that up slowly, but he's both an older prospect, and he came in to the league as just a catch and shoot guy. And a lot of his efficiency, even this year that he broke out in, that efficiency comes from just being an insane level shooter that even if you bring his percentages down a little bit from 3 by taking tougher shots, it still works. But then you look at other guys. Keon Thompson never broke through. Josh Christopher never broke through. Quentin Grimes is very much a 3-and-D type guy. He's just really good at it, and he has that mid-range game, but he's a very stiff. I pull it up, not a lot of craft to him. Cam Thomas is obviously the exception here, but Bones Highland, Jaden Springer, like all of these guys, even Miles McBride to a lesser extent, even Dosunmu, it's the same thing. Like all of these guys feel like they lack that component, and I think that's tied to what the COVID years did to the college game and all of the development that guys were not able to get. I think that really hurt a bit of a generation of players.
And
go ahead.
Good. I was just going to say the silver lining to put on it, maybe with these particular players and this dynamic you're describing, maybe this makes them an exception to the usual rule in that there's still a little bit more upward mobility when they're 24, 25, because their development was a little bit stunted relative to most guys when they're 20 and 21.
Yeah, I do think that could be the case. Whether or not the Rockets are in a position to give him that long is a different question. But
Right.
but then when you pick it back up, later on, Ivy is someone who has a floater game, but also coming out of the draft. I don't know if you remember about his draft profile, was someone that was very limited at certain things like the jump passing. I don't know if you remember that was a big thing with him. Like he just didn't have a plan, right? He didn't have that craft, that pace, I guess, and he would go up without a plan a lot. But then as you move on, like Casey Wallace is a little bit more of a touch guy. Just talking about 2 years ago draft, it's a lot less of the case. Like Keontae George, the same thing. I'm trying to bring it to get names out. Brendan Podziemski, the same thing. Like you start getting Marcus Sasser, obviously the same thing. You start getting again guys that have that craft to game. And I think that's tied to obviously the COVID years and what that took away from development of guys. This is something that was talked about at the time that never got picked up again. And here's how that ties up with Jalen. Like that's why it's so hard to identify why stuff goes wrong, because that type of craftiness only shows itself in certain scenarios, right? And he's so athletic and he's so talented that he can make up for it sometimes. And it's why we try to find patterns with him, and it's just impossible. And it often comes off as excuses. And I had a tweet about this when I was just venting post game, which I said, I'm just tired of making excuses for him. Like you've heard these arguments at certain points in Kevin's career. Oh, he's better at home. Oh, he's better on the road. Oh, he's better against shot blocking bigs. Oh, he's better against no. Oh, he can score over shot blocking bigs. Oh, he can score over switchable bigs because they keep up with him and he can just blow by them. He's only good when the shot's falling. Oh, he's only good when he's finishing at the rim. Oh, you can. Oh, he's only good when he gets a good, like he's only good when Steven Adams is screening for him. Oh, he's only good in the when it's 2-man game with spread pick and roll with Alperen Sengun. Like we've tried 100 different hypotheses of why in which situations Jalen Green's good. And at a certain point, it just gets tiring as a fan and as an analyst. And it's like, well, maybe he's just not good, right? And I think that at this point, that would be a valid position. And that is a valid position for people to have. But I also think that there's got to be a little bit of space for the argument that I just made about his upbringing, not upbringing, but his basketball upbringing and how COVID affected all of it. Doesn't mean that the Rockets should, hitch their wagon to him forever. But I'm kind of stretching it a bit and I'm grasping at straws, I guess, trying to find a reason. And the only other thing that I can imagine that kind of makes it even harder for him to have that type of craft. And this is going to sound ridiculous, but I swear it's a pattern. Dude has tiny hands. And sometimes it's just as simple as that. It's so much harder. Like if you've played basketball, it is so much harder to have that type of craft and to play on pace and to have good handles. And even on shooting, the way you grip the ball really hurts if your hands are small and you can't like palm it, or you can't like when you look at obviously shooting guards, the shooting guards of all time, I guess, guys that mostly relied on athleticism and jumping over, like Jordan could palm the ball, Kobe could palm the ball. Like when you look at these guys that they had the athleticism and they obviously had the craft, right? But I think there's two archetypes of shooting guards. There's the athletic guys that have the shooting, the fadeaways, all of that, and there's the smaller guys that are not as athletic that rely on floaters a lot more. And I think I think if you've watched enough basketball and you were familiar with enough players, you can kind of make that distinction. And I think Jalen falls on the more Kobe, Jordan type guys that are really athletic, but at the same, and so he perhaps
You're saying he's still Jordan or Kobe. That's what you're telling us.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if he
No, I know what you
projected
mean.
hit if he projected, but just for the audience, if he projected to hit that type of game, I guess he wouldn't need these kill shots because those guys didn't really play with those types of skill shots. They could make them occasionally, but it was mostly a shoot over you type thing. And when they had to finish at the rim or around the rim, a lot of it is just the ability to grab the ball and, have control over it when you go up with it. Like if Jalen has to go up with one hand, he's either like pinning the ball against his forearm. I think forearm is the correct thing. He's either doing that and sometimes he loses it, or he needs two hands. And that's why he struggles to finish through contact a lot as well. And if you've ever shot a basketball from three in your life, you know that your shooting form, if you can palm the ball or if you can hold the ball in place with one hand, it gives you a lot more flexibility on your shooting. And I think it was Basketball Breakdown, the guy on Twitter that I used to make the clips about James Harden traveling. He had a point about this as well that applies to Fred VanVleet as well, who also has tiny hands. Shooting consistency is a lot of the times tied to from three. Is a lot of the times tied to hand size, and so it's just a lot of that. Those are just a lot of thoughts that I had on Jalen. Some of them to kind of try to make sense of this, because even if I advocate for a Jalen trade and it depends on the opportunity, I have to understand why it went wrong. And I've been exhaustive about that for a really long time. This is an answer that I have never had before, and that's where I stand at this point. Doesn't mean that I back continuing with Jalen as the only option or even as the primary option. Still need to make up my mind on what scenarios I'm okay with. But I really needed to talk about those two things because maybe I'm finally onto something, because I've had 300 theories over the last 4 years. And so I actually think that makes sense. And I had
and there is some broader context.
Yeah.
And to close the loop on the Jalen discussion, I think we're in alignment on not moving him unless it's, part of just a slam dunk deal that's transformative. Because even if you could make a statistical based case for, as you said, a Colin Sexton type of player who, if you strictly look at the data, could be better on certain nights, certain matchups, there's at least upside with Jalen Green. With his age, continuity means something for this roster. The fact that Ime Udoka trusts him defensively, trusts his attitude. The fact that, as I said earlier, I think worst case, a year or two, there's no reason to think he wouldn't be a good sixth man. I think if you greatly simplified his role and structured his matchups a bit more to his liking, then there's definitely something there with the explosion, the elite athleticism that he has. The worst thing you could do would be to trade him just to trade him, and you bring in someone who wouldn't move the needle all that much for Ime Udoka, and because he's older, he's, taking up more of your salary cap. Well, I know Jalen's salary is getting more expensive, but at least other teams might view him as a change of scenery guy who clearly is young and has a lot of talent. You bring in a Colin Sexton type, it limits your future optionality as well. So for a number of reasons, even if you can make an argument looking strictly at the data and say that a certain player might be a slight upgrade, at least statistically on Jalen, I don't think it's worth it when you consider the broader context of this team. I think the smart play is just to give him at least one more year to try and make some of these improvements. And if for some reason he doesn't, then, even if it's not looking great, then he's going to be much more tradable when that contract is closer to its expiration. There's no reason to trade him now unless, someone is really trading for him at, close to peak value. And I doubt that's going to be the case coming off this series. So even if it's unpleasant to hear, I think, stock down after this series, but for the Rockets, it's hold. One other guy, the only other guy I had in my stock down category, and we'll go much more quickly because I don't want this pod to run much more than an hour. The only other stock down guy I had, and Paulo, you might recoil at this, was your boy Tari Eason. I still like him overall, but even though I did say with the net ratings, Jalen at plus 5.6, I said small sample, mitigating circumstances, you can't put a ton into that. The reason I am putting something into Tari being minus 8.1 against the Warriors, by far the worst of the 8 rotation players, is that it meshes exactly with what I was told before the series, during the series, and after the series, which is that it's not a favorable matchup for him. They worried about his propensity to gamble against a very disciplined Warriors team that if you're not disciplined in your assignments, if you're trying to shoot a gap and make the highlight reel play, they'll get an open three for Steph or Buddy in a heartbeat. They did not think this was a good matchup for Tari Eason going in. And so when the data meshes with their fears going into the series, there's probably something to that. And it's not something that you should panic over because he's just 23 years old, year 3, and it sort of feels like year 2 because almost all of last year was lost due to the injuries, and he had some of that this year. But for a guy that we've talked so glowingly about in the past, he has the Terror Twins moniker with Amen Thompson. Well, they both have that terror gear, but the difference is that Amen can play in different ways. Whereas with Tari, it feels like there's one way that he plays. And there's still time, and, perhaps his development was a little bit stunted because of the injuries. That's the hope. But for him to fully achieve the upside scenarios, because we've talked on this pod about him potentially being a star-level player if everything clicks, he needs to be able to play in different ways. And so the same questions that are there with Jalen, when I mentioned if there's all of these qualifiers, if it takes the right matchup, the right players around him, then how good is he really if it only happens under a select group of circumstances? The same thing is true with Tari Eason if it requires a certain matchup and playing a certain way to bring out the best version. And that's not me saying I'm out on Tari Eason. No matter what, he's a valuable player off the bench. But when it comes to the high-end projections, and you see how poorly he fared relative to the rest of that rotation against the Warriors, and combine it with the fact that the Rockets themselves were worried about this very dynamic going into the series, it's not nearly as drastic as Jalen, but I did think it's a little bit of a disappointing series for Tari Eason, and I would like to see him come back in year 4 as a more disciplined, well-rounded player whose game translates to more matchups. It's not the end of the world if it doesn't. Worst case, he's still a very good role player. But when we talk about these very high-end outcomes, I can't look at this series as anything other than a stock down. He's my last stock down guy. Paulo, where did you have him? And do you have any other stock down guys before we move on?
So on Tari, I have to push back. I do not have him as a stock down guy. And I am biased towards him. You guys know that, but I do agree with you in the sense that this wasn't a good matchup for him. He does feast on generating turnovers, and the Warriors were just like, even though we were able to generate turnovers, they are, as you said, one of the most disciplined teams I've ever seen. And I don't really understand why, because whatever, it's their system. That's how it works. I think that it's that. But I'm not sure I agree with the sense that it's him gambling, even though I do think that he does that a little bit. I think it's that plus one of the concerns that was with him coming out of the draft. I don't know if you remember, but one of the reasons he dropped to 17, which is wild at that point, I think it was 17 or 16, I think, was because there was a rumor going around that he couldn't understand defensive sets. Do you remember that one?
Yeah. Sort of.
I'm not saying it's that at all. I'm saying it is a little bit of him losing focus at times. In the same way that, for example, Jalen Brown, who everybody agrees is a good defender, sometimes loses focus. And if you go back to the Warriors series in the finals, the Warriors in specific, Jalen Brown was getting exploited left and right. If he was losing track of guys, he was kind of not engaged 100% of the time, and it's not a hustle thing, it's a little bit of a mental. And Tari does gamble a little bit, but I think it's that combined with this other facet of, sometimes he just switches off for a second, or he's seeing something else other than what is actually happening. And it's not switching off in the sense of not hustling, it's switching off in the sense of being out of the scheme that you were supposed to run, or messing up what you're supposed to do, right? Not really falling asleep and letting guys cut behind him, although that does happen, and it happened against the Warriors. I think I think those two are obvious. What I want to highlight is sometimes reacting to the offense in a way that you're not supposed to, even though like it's more of a focus thing and a mental thing of messing stuff up rather than the other things. But on the other end, like I think it's, as you said, it was the worst possible matchup for Tart. I think he would have done really well against any of the other playoff teams, and I think they basically nullified the entire Terror Twins dynamic. It's something that only the Warriors can do, and I think that was a big advantage of one of the big regular season that I think would have translated against any other team. But as far as stock down, there's two guys that I want to mention that they are not stock down. That's not what I mean, but that they were in danger of being stock down. First one is Fred VanVleet. He was obviously amazing in the games, in those 3 games, or those 2 games and half of one. But you can also at the same time see a little bit of the limitation, right? He can't have that big of a role. He has to be a supporting piece, and he was asked to be a star piece in these games. But he rebounded, obviously, and had a great series overall. The other guy I want to say is, because you can say that you can't lose a series and only have 2 stock down guys. And to me, Tarisan is not a stock down guy; he's neutral.
I think it's a 7-game series loss against a good team. That's why I have the majority of the team in the neutral rather than down. But fair, we can quibble over this.
Yeah, my point is actually that even though overall they're not stock down guys, the times in which they were stock down guys cost you the game. And so you lost those games, and when they were stock up guys, it didn't necessarily win you the game, if that makes sense. And I'm talking about Ime Thompson. It was clear to me that first 3 games of the series, he was just 3 or 4 games in the series, he was just not himself. He was shook a bit. Defensively, he wasn't as influential as he typically is. Obviously, the Warriors scheme also makes it harder for us to deploy him in the ways that we like to deploy him, where he's able to help off ball, where he's able to make plays on other people besides his matchup. Against the Warriors, we're trying to hack every single shooter, and it's tough to let a man roam free in a sense. And the spacing is always so constant that it's tough for a man to be able to play both players at the same time. But this to say that his growth throughout the series, it being linear always helps. Makes it so he was actually a plus for me, right? A framed up. I don't remember what the language was that you used, but training
stock up.
Stock up, that's right.
And let me push back real quick. We can do our little amend thing here. I actually think you're underselling or overstating the bad games. I think Game 2 was a crazy outlier. It became very easy to sort of tie it in with Game 1 and Game 3 because they bookended it. But if you recall how Game 2 actually went, he started very well, had 6 points in the first couple of minutes, seemed energetic as all hell. He got into foul trouble on some truly bizarre calls. Many of those were not his fault, including the third, which took him out for the entire half when Steven Adams and Draymond Green bumped him into Jimmy Butler. That was when Jimmy got hurt. And then Ime was shut down for the half, and then he comes back in the second half, and the Rockets are up 20 points. Jalen is cooking, and you're not going to go away from the formula that's working. So I would say Game 2, I almost throw it out for Ime in that I think by and large he played well in the very limited sample. And then even by, normally you'd say, well, the player got in foul trouble because he picked up fouls. No, those were pretty weird, especially the third one that just completely transformed his outlook. I would say Game 1 and Game 3 he was subpar, that's for sure. But I thought Game 2 should have been a lot better. And then from Game 4 onward, he was very, very good. And as we saw during the season, the most encouraging thing with the men, when the game was most meaningful, that Game 7, he was your best player. Just like we saw at times throughout the year when the lights were at their brightest, obviously the game in Boston, that tended to be when you had the peak version of Ime Thompson. There's something special to be said when a guy has that type of makeup that he rises to the occasion when the lights are at their brightest. So I agree with you. Game 1, especially Game 3, were disappointing, but by and large, good series for Ime Thompson, great finish. And so I had him as a stock up.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you on the overall. I just think we have to mention guys that rose throughout the series. And Amen was one of those guys, and that means also talking about how earlier on he was struggling. And I don't mean only offense, but defensively as well. Well, not really struggling, but not being as impactful as I expected him to be. And obviously, disclaimer, I'm not saying and I'm going to talk about one more person that these guys underperformed or anything like that. I'm saying that they lost the series, and so I'm going to nitpick a little bit on things that I thought could have been better. And to me, these guys are kind of more in the neutral zone, neutral positive. And then later, as we move on to within the segment, I'll talk about guys who were clear stock ups for me, right? And that guy that I was going to mention is Ime Udoka. Seager's the best playoff coaches to me of all time, or ever since I've watched basketball. He just has crazy good adjustments, not only defensively but offensively as well. And with Ime, we saw I was really impressed in his ability to rally the team after being down 3-1. He deserves credit for that. And the different types of looks we threw at the Warriors defensively, he deserves credit for that as well. But even still, the lack of adjustments really hurt, and is probably the biggest reason why we lost. And so, not out only nothing like that. I think he was throughout these playoffs a neutral to positive, but I do think that you have to mention that offensively, he's a part of the reason also why we went down 3-1 to begin with. But once again, not saying these guys are stuck down. But I do think that they are stock neutral, and Amen to me stock up just because of how linear it was his progress throughout the series and how impressive he was the last 3 games. So, yeah, I'll let you move on to stock ups for you.
Yeah, well, let me jump in real quick. I had Ime in stock neutral for many of the same reasons. I think you can't discount the culture, and the Warriors raved after the series about how tough the Rockets were, the level of fight they had. That's Ime Udoka. The defense 100% translated, including Alperen Şengün, and I know we'll get to that. So any questions about the defense, which is Ime Udoka's forte, how would that translate to a playoff setting? Would teams find a way to exploit Alperen Şengün? Absolutely not. So a defensive coach, to see it fully translate the way it did against the Warriors, I can't give him, a stock down after that. However, just as we talked about Jalen not having a lot of counters individually, it felt like Ime Udoka didn't on the offensive end of the floor either. Really, the only counter he had was Steven Adams and the double big. And I mentioned this on the last pod. Steven's a clear positive. He was amazing in this series. The differentials don't lie. But his increased role down the stretch of the year was not some strategic masterclass. The Rockets did not fully anticipate the double big going as it did, or thinking they would even need the double big to the extent they did. It's just at some point in the year, the data was so damning on their lack of half-court execution on offense that they realized that their only chance to beat a good team in the playoffs was going to be getting as many offensive rebounds as possible and mucking it up. And to Steven's credit, he played really well, and he excelled in that role, and I hope they bring him back. By the way, if they bring him back, and they should, he'll be a free agent. I think, the Rockets have bird rights. They have every reason to want to bring him back. I would think that Steven has interest in coming back. I'm not sure, as good as the playoffs were, he played just 58 games, averaged 13 minutes a game in the regular season. Not sure a true starting level gig at more than MLE money will be out there. And even if it was, I'm not sure in his 30s if he would want to take that bet. He might prefer to be in a timeshare arrangement in Houston where they can load manage him during the regular season. And obviously, Ime Udoka has proven that if the play warrants it, he'll scale up that role and find a way to play him 25, 30 minutes per game in the playoffs. I think for Steven in his second decade in the NBA, this might be the perfect spot for him. And obviously, he excelled in his role, and I would love to have him back. He's huge from a leadership and a culture perspective. So when I say that he was the only adjustment for Ime Udoka, and I'm somewhat criticizing that, I'm not criticizing Steven at all. It just felt like that Ime Udoka somewhere along the way just sort of said, hey, this team just isn't going to have it in these spots. And so the only thing I think I can do is go to more Steven Adams. And in this series, I had Jabari. I wanted to have Jabari in stock up because from an efficiency perspective, he had a true shooting percentage of almost 68. He shot, I think, 46% from three. And yet he only played 12 minutes in Game 7. And I think he was at barely above 20 for the series. So at some point, Ime Udoka is not an idiot. There's some reason. Maybe it's a practice thing. Maybe, I don't know. It's just gut feel for how certain lineups perform. But as good as Jabari's efficiency metrics are, at some point, I have a tough time saying clearly stock up if he's not convincing the coaching staff, even with these elite metrics, that he's worthy of more than 20 minutes per game. But conversely, it felt like Ime didn't try. And if he doesn't think it's a series for Jabari, fine. If he doesn't think it is for Tari for the reasons we talked about earlier, okay. They barely tried Aaron Holiday. And if you go further down the rotation, there's a reason why throughout the year people advocated to give a little bit more leash to Cam Whitmore and Reed Shepherd. They weren't going to turn to them in this series, but it's not just this series. It's who's actually prepared to take on that role. And they weren't in a spot where they were even close. There were guys they theoretically, if you were totally out on Reed and Cam this year, you could have gone after guys at the trade deadline, and they didn't. It just felt like, to me, that Ime Udoka had his starters, and not everyone loved it, but clearly Fred, Jalen, Dylan, and I had Dylan as neutral. It was an okay series for Dylan, but the 0 for 3 from distance in Game 7 and some of the off-ball lapses against Buddy Hield prevent me from saying that it was stock up. Even though the true shooting was like 59, still a decent series overall, I just can't say with how Dylan performed in Game 7 that it was a stock up, even though at times in the series he did help them out of sticky half-court situations with some decent shot making. So I threw in that one quickly. But to get back to the broader point, which is Ime, he's got his starters, Fred, Jalen, Dylan, Amen, and Şengün. And then clearly Steven became the most trusted guy off the bench. And there was nothing other than that. And in a series where the Rockets were constantly behind the 8 ball, they were down 23 points after the first 30 minutes of a home Game 1. They were down 3-1 in the series. They were down 15 points right after halftime in a home Game 7. For a team that was as behind the 8 ball as the Rockets were, to not have any adjustment other than, at least in terms of personnel, and I think to a large extent tactical as well, let's just go super big and try and rebound our way out of this mess and get enough shots or fouls that somehow we have enough points to be competitive. Maybe it's personnel. That's why I'm not going to say it's negative. And I'm also, the defense was good enough that it's not negative overall. Let's be clear. But I can't call it stock up because it just felt like tactics, personnel, Steven Adams double big was the only counter they had if that starting lineup wasn't working the way they wanted to. It could be increased experimenting with Jabari and Tari. It could be guys further down the rotation. It could be advocating for a pickup at the trade deadline. There's lots of different ways you can go about it. It could be having Reed and Cam in a better position to be ready if the situation warrants. But Steven being the only guy outside of the top 5 that was really the change it up piece of the equation. Steven was great in that role. I hope they bring him back. But if they bring him back, and I think they will, I think it's more likely than not, I hope they bring him back as a backup center that's, certainly scalable and gives you the option to play different ways. And on occasion, if the matchup warrants it, sure, you can go double big. But I don't want double big to be the Band-Aid that it was down the stretch of this season. I want them to figure out ways to be more efficient, to have more shot making, more creation offensively, and maybe that means dialing up the role and usage for guys like Jabari and Tari. We hope Reed and Cam play more next year. Or maybe it's an external acquisition. I don't know. But it just felt like for Ime Udoka that Steven Adams was the only adjustment. And while he was an incredible Band-Aid, it was a Band-Aid nonetheless. And I think you needed more than one of those if you're going to beat a really good team like Golden State. So that's sort of my Ime take. It wasn't a bad series by any means. The defense translated in the macro. That might be the most important thing. But, the lack of personnel and tactical counters, it keeps me from rating it positively. And by the way, we've mentioned almost everybody at this point. Let's throw in Alperen Şengün as well. I had him as a neutral. I suspect you're going to have him as a stock up. The only reason why I had him as a neutral, as good as the defense was, and I agree with you, it was outstanding, I can't call it stock up when you're a big man and your true shooting percentage for the series is 49. And after having a good game one, it was 46.5 the rest of the way. You can call it stock up if you try and look at it in the super macro, in that, you can just look at last season, and we have reasons to think that Şengün's going to improve, and that this year overall was just a one-off when it comes to him not having the touch that he normally does. But in this series, I can't call it a clear stock up when you're that inefficient as a big guy. But it's also not stock down if you defend at the level that Şengün did. So while I'm understanding of you being high on him, I had Şengün as a neutral simply because he made up for it in ways that Jalen didn't. But he was nearly as inefficient as Jalen, and so that's what made me, neutral rather than positive.
So on Şengün, I had my rant last podcast. Before we get to him, just quick fire. Jabari, massive stock up. Who else did Dylan neutral for me? Who else? Am I missing someone? Adams, obviously massive stock up. You've got to bring him back. You should be able to. No team can offer him more than the MLE. That would make sense to offer him that money. Like, if you're acting as a below the cap team to sign Steven Adams probably shouldn't want to go play for you at this stage in his career. And I mean, just do the smart thing. Listen, if it has to be a 3-year, $45 million contract, it makes all the sense in the world. It's going to be a bargain by the time it gets to the last year, considering how the cap is going to continue to grow. So, and he was just massive. You made all the points about the over dependence on it. I'm not going to get into that as well. I fully agree with everything you said. I'll talk about a little bit more about Alperen Şengün. To me, the reason he's a stock up is because he made me feel like this series doesn't matter. Because he and the man are the sole reason why it doesn't sting as much that we lost the series. Because I came away from it feeling like, okay, Alperen Şengün's the corner piece for this franchise. He wasn't making shots, but he was still shooting. He was still going out there and fighting on the offensive end, trying to back up Draymond. Listen, it's not working, but we're not getting any better shots. So it's either I start making these shots or we're going to lose the game anyways. Something that Jalen didn't get going. And so he kept trying. He missed a lot in the moment. You'll probably find tweets of me criticizing him, but because that's in the moment, he was missing shots, but the fighting spirit was there. And to me, the defense was just so outstanding. Like, I have zero doubts at this point in my mind that he will be and that he is a better defender than Al Horford is and has been for a lot of the later stages of his career. And we often talked about Al Horford as the template of how a guy that with Şengün's frame can be effective on defense. And he showed a lot of that. He was mobile. He was switching. He was blitzing. He was recovering. He was chasing out closeouts. He was being smart and making the correct decisions on defense. It was a moment in which I saw him play, and I'm like, it really doesn't matter. Like, if you're not going to get exposed defensively at all, like, you're actually one of the biggest positives on the team, in my opinion. That completely changes the outlook, because that's what he was working on the entire offseason. And that type of work doesn't go away. He's not gonna forget how to play defense. And unless he stops taking care of his body, which I don't think he'll do, he's not gonna lose that mobility. And the Warriors tested him as much as any team can test him, besides vertical spacing, which can be a problem still. But I mean, I doubt you can lose a series just purely based off of vertical spacing. And so, on the offensive end, I have. And I'm going to knock on wood here, but I have zero doubt in my mind that with an offseason in which he's going to focus on these touch shots and in which he recognizes that his offense hasn't been there all year, I think if Alperen Şengün is going to spend the offseason working on his offense after neglecting it really for the last offseason. All we heard about was conditioning and defense and all of these things is really scary. For other teams.
And to Şengün's credit, he called out the offense after Game 7, said this was a substandard season for him, which it was, and that's a huge part of being able to improve, is having the self-awareness to know what you need to work on and to have the humility to, not try and just sunshine pump and look at the counting stats. No, he knows he can be better. He's saying it on the record, and that's a big part of doing what it takes to actually improve it.
Yeah, and he strikes me a bit of as and I've talked about this before, the James Harden type. You saw James Harden season over season, off season, always came back with a new weapon. And to me, right now it's not really about getting a new weapon. It's about getting back the weapons that he had before that he neglected because he recognized that defense was a big part of what he needed to get better at in order for this team to become a playoff team. And now to say that, I think that's an acquired skill at this point. And so now he's going to work on his offense, and I'm really excited to see what he looks like next season because I'm truly, truly convinced that he's going to be a lot better offensively. And so that's why, to me, it's got to be a trend up because you remove an existential flaw of you as a prospect. That you could have shot 1 for 20 in Game 7, and I'm like, listen, happens. Bad shooting nights happen. You just removed the one thing that I could not, Şengün proves me wrong every step of the way, right? And to me, it was always tough to give him that much credit because of that aspect of, I just don't quite know how you're going to hold up defensively in a playoff series. And that's something that you can't take away until you actually do it. And he did it, and he was not only passable, he was outstanding. And so that just almost turns him into a different prospect and into a different player in my eyes. And so after that, to me, he's got to be a massive stock up. Even though if you are purely talking about his performance within the series and discounting his bad offense into his outstanding defense, I can understand why he's a neutral to slight positive if we're just talking about the series. But to me, I can't just do that. I've got to take into consideration what this means moving forward. And moving forward, to me, that's moving from a guy that's moving from a low-tier all-star to a guy that's going to have the impact of a superstar, which is what I believe Alperen Şengün is going to have. And so, that's why to me it has to be stuck up because I can't separate what happened in this series from what this means moving forward.
Well, and along those same lines, that's part of my argument for Fred VanVleet. Now, the one distinction I would make is that the aggregate of Fred's performance, his true shooting percentage for the series was over 63. That's insanely good. But one of the reasons that I'm so high, maybe a little bit higher than you, on Fred's performance after this series is you can certainly split it in two. And Fred was below average efficiency in the first 3 games, and in the last 4, he was insanely good. That's true. But I think from an on-court perspective, when you strip away the obvious benefits, the reasons you bring in Fred VanVleet when it comes to leadership, mentoring, culture, extension of the coaching staff, what you want is the ability to be a playoff riser. The guy I would most compare him to is Chris Paul earlier this decade with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in Oklahoma City in that backcourt, and then with Devin Booker in the Phoenix Suns. You're not asking him to be a super efficient, high-usage guy throughout the season. You're asking him to be a steadying force to help promote the development of the potential star backcourt guy next to him. And finally, perhaps the most important piece of this puzzle, if and when you get to the playoffs, to have that extra gear, that playoff riser factor, to where you can lean on him a little bit more in a tight spot, and he's capable of scaling up his production. And even though this year overall was subpar for Fred relative to expectations, I think what he did in this series reminds you why the Rockets are justified in wanting to bring him back, and I'm almost certain that they will. And, you can quibble over the Chris Paul comparisons, not because of Fred, but because, to this point, Jalen is not close to SGA or Devin Booker, and that's a fair concern. But in terms of Fred's piece of the puzzle, and to, where I see some similarities to the argument you're making with Şengün, for the broader mission, the formula that the Rockets are trying to put together, this puzzle for an eventual title contender, what Fred showed you in this series, beyond just the numbers, was that he still has the ability, even now at 31, to do all of the things that they want him to do when this team, hopefully as soon as a year from now, is truly in contention mode. So that's why I had Fred as clearly a stock up. I can respect the argument for Şengün. I would note that Fred had a true shooting percentage above 63 and Şengün right at 49. But overall, in the bigger picture, I think they're both stock up for the same reason. And by the way, there was one other topic I wanted to get to on today's pod, but I think we've already answered it with our analysis of stock up, stock down, and neutral. Should the Rockets stay the course? Roster continuity was the phrase Rafael Stone said at the end of season press conference, or should they go star chasing, as some around the league expect them to do? They've been linked, well, more speculation, but to potential names on the market like Giannis, like Kevin Durant, like Zion Williamson. It could always be posturing what they say, in that you certainly don't want to indicate for leverage purposes that you're desperate to make a move. But I really think they're telling the truth in this case. And I'm okay with staying the course, because with Ime and Şengün as building blocks, showing you in this series that either it translated, or in Şengün's case, there's a pretty clear path to it translating. Really, the only guy left in your true core that you could perhaps look to move on from is Jalen. But for the reasons we outlined earlier, it doesn't really make sense to trade him just to trade him. If you can do it as part of a mega deal and you're really convinced that a guy you're getting makes sense on every level, but then why would a team give up a player of that with Jalen as the centerpiece of the offer? They're probably going to want Ime or Şengün, and I'm not willing to do that in most cases after this series. So if Ime and Şengün are even higher on the list, and Jalen, he's not higher, but for the reasons we've outlined, is, a bit lower, but it doesn't make sense to trade him at this time in most situations. And then, your other core seven, Tari and Jabari, they're nice players, but I don't think they're really needle movers in terms of, mega trade packages. And you have a fairly deep team already, so it's not like they would be looking for a mid-tier guy. If they do a major trade, it would be for, one of the blockbusters. When you add it all up, unless you are really convinced and a guy really wants to be in Houston and everything lines up, I tend to think you stay the course. And, Reed Sheppard and Cam Whitmore, you sort of have to throw them in the same bucket as Tari and Jabari, not from the standpoint of their archetypes as players, but they just haven't played enough to where they would move the needle. Even if you throw in all the future draft assets, they have a lot from the Phoenix Suns, the Brooklyn Nets, you'd have to give up some sort of present value. That's the way 95% of these star trades work. And I just don't know who the Rockets, how they would subtract enough. And you'd also have to take away from the current team to fit in rotation minutes if you're bringing in, a star that's going to play 35 plus minutes per game. When you actually think it through, I don't see Tari, Jabari, Reed, or Cam moving the needle. And personally, that's another reason why I'm okay with staying the course. I'm bullish on Reed Sheppard in year two. I thought he looked better in the glimpses we saw late in the season. I heard very encouraging things behind the scenes. If you give Reed Sheppard the Aaron Holiday role, which he had at the start of the year, and then, he lost it, and maybe he was more ready for it by the end of the year, but they weren't going to make that type of change with the playoff race going on and trying to lock up the number 2 seed. That's some upward mobility. Besides just the guys in your current rotation getting better, you can slide in Reed or maybe Cam into those Aaron Holiday minutes and give you some more juice, some more upside just by staying the course. So for all those reasons, with Ime and Şengün taking leaps forward and Jalen just it not most likely being the right time to trade him, because why would another team, we say all this, if he's valued not that positively, and then if he is, but then from the other perspective, why would a team, when we list out these limitations, why would a team value Jalen all that highly, another team that is at this point? For all those reasons, I'm inclined to stay the course. I'm okay with it. It's not sexy. There will be some coming off a 7-game loss to the Warriors that hate it. But I think when you look at it in totality, when you look at the market factors, what it would take to get a deal done, I don't think they have to start chase. And I'm guessing we're in alignment based on the analysis that you've already thrown out, right?
So to me, I think you are leaning, I think you're closer to staying the course than I am. I think I'm a little bit further away from it, but it doesn't mean that I wouldn't be okay with it. But I do think that I'm gonna give you a take because I don't want to run away from the question, but I do want some more time to figure out exactly what I want and don't want, because I think there is arguments for both sides, and I do think it's okay to give it a little bit more time. But where I sit right now currently, my current perspective is Booker would make sense, Mitchell would make sense.
But I don't think they're on the market.
Yeah, I don't think they're on the market. Maybe if the Cavs get swept in the second round, listen, Pacers, help us out here. KD, depending on price, may make sense, but even a guy like KD, so Donovan and Devin Booker, they would be foundational differences. KD as a lower price star guy, because of how old he is, comes in a different light, because it doesn't necessarily completely wipe off your team dynamic or remove a massive building block. Kind of like the Jimmy Butler acquisition by the Warriors at the deadline. It's a star trade, but it's not this completely changes the outlook of the team by trade. So if it's I could see the argument right now, right? I retain the right to change my take as time goes along. This is not a strong opinion. I could see a foundational move if it's specifically for a shooting guard, and I could see a non-foundational star move for an older guy that would work, that wouldn't cost the core asset that we have to move at this point. I would be open to those two possibilities. Regarding middle ground upgrades of specific role guys, maybe a scoring shooting guard off the bench, or whatever you want. Like if you don't believe in Reed, maybe a backup point guard, or moving on from Fred, trying to seek an upgrade there, or a slight upgrade from Jalen if it's a Zach LaVine type, stuff like that. I currently don't have a strong opinion on it. I need some more time to look into what might be available and what is out there in the league that would fit in the sense of what I talked about earlier, in that any upgrade that comes in needs to be a capable defender or be able to mold it into a capable defender via extra effort. I haven't made that research yet, so that's currently what I said.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got a few months to keep going on this, and really, I don't expect most of the situations to come to a head until closer to the draft in late June, and obviously the start of free agency at the beginning of July. So we've got some time. We can come back to this. So yeah, it's fair. And using that same logic, we can also wait to see what the market values of the Rockets' assets are, and that could influence it as well. Because again, part of my read on this, it's not just saying, oh, the Rockets are fine, they don't need to do anything. It's more looking at how I think their available assets would be viewed on the market, and whether the ones that I think are truly movable in the eyes of this front office, would they get you the type of difference maker that justifies the move. And I just have a tough time seeing it now, but maybe the market is higher on some of these players or assets than I think, and we'll see based on some of the reporting over the next 6 to 8 weeks as we get closer to free agency. Rockets will have we'll see if it's non-taxpayer or taxpayer, but they will have the MLE available to them. So if we're talking about a moderate upgrade, they should be a fairly desirable destination coming off a 52-30 season, number 2 in the West. So that's a tool to keep in the back of your mind as well if we're talking about just adding, a role player type to give you a little bit more depth. The MLE could definitely be a factor as well. You won't have to use that for Steven Adams because you have bird rights there. So to wind down the pod, just to go very quick, for me, my list was stock down, Jalen and Tari; stock neutral, Ime, Jabari, Dylan, and Şengün; stock up was Amen, Fred, and Steven Adams. How did you rank those 9 guys?
So not necessarily ranking, but just stock up, stock down. I think stock down was Jalen. Stock neutral was Tari, Dylan, Ime, and that's probably it. Stock up, I would say Amen, Şengün, Jabari, and Fred. I think that's it.
And Steven.
Oh, and Steven. Steven is so obvious that there's no way you could have put him anywhere.
Yeah. And Jabari is the most interesting case because, the efficiency numbers were fantastic. There's just something that keeps me from calling it positive when the Rockets so clearly had this deficiency, and yet for one reason or another, Ime Udoka didn't play him more than 20 minutes per game. So be it the matchup, be it what they see in practice, in the film room, whatever the case may be, there's got to be some reason. I don't think Ime Udoka is incompetent. Now, that doesn't mean he can't make a mistake, but it's just, it keeps me, even though the efficiency numbers overall, even with a 1-for-5 showing in Game 7, were excellent, the minutes total was low enough that there's got to be some other piece to the puzzle that we don't know, and so that's why I'm going neutral there. But totally respect your argument when you look at strictly the data for him being a stock up heading into a contract off season for him and Tari Eason. Last thing very quickly, we will have a pod next week recapping the draft lottery. Rockets enter, of course, via the Phoenix Suns with the 9th best odds. The good news, that's the exact slot they were in a year ago with the Brooklyn Nets, I believe, before they jumped up to number 3 and got Reed Shepherd. Hawks were in that range as well, so there's certainly precedent for a team with similar odds of moving up into the top 4 with the era of trying to disincentivize tanking. It's conceivable that the Rockets could move up, so we'll hope for that. The other little tidbit I wanted to put out there before we wind down the pod, I've heard that besides themselves, the one other team the Rockets would love to jump into the top 4 of the lottery, and ideally 3 or 4, would be the Brooklyn Nets for a couple of reasons. One, you'd obviously rather elite talent, and the crown jewel of just this class is Cooper Flagg out of Duke, projected to go 1. You'd always prefer elite talent to go to the East. But the other factor here is that if the Nets get a young cornerstone, they're more likely to build around that player. You typically don't see top 4 picks traded. And so because of that, the swap right unprotected that the Rockets still have in 27 from the original James Harden deal with the Brooklyn Nets is all the more valuable if they're going to be young for the reasons we know all too well from the last few years. Most young players do not contribute at a high level to winning, especially if they're flanked by other young players. I think the idea is that if they get a top 4 pick in this draft, the Nets would be more likely to have the entire roster along a similar timeline, as opposed to, if they stay at 6 or they drop to 7 or 8, the Nets might be more inclined to say, F it, this isn't going to be that good anyway. We're Brooklyn. We have a huge market in New York. Let's just go and aggressively, either this offseason or next, try and trade for big-name veterans, get competitive, and then hope we can, star chase on the trade market by just advertising our location, the bright lights, everything that comes from playing in New York City. So I understand there's a pushback in that if they go all the way up to 1, is Cooper Flagg good enough to where even by 2027 at 21 years old, he's helping them win, or maybe he's a draw to another star? Maybe. But I think the ideal scenario would be they move up to 3 or 4, and so they get a guy that could be a cornerstone, good enough that they're not going to move the pick. They're likely to stay young, but not good enough to be, quite to the Cooper level of transformative. I think that's the ideal scenario. So certainly the Rockets are more concerned about themselves first, but beyond that, I think they would love to see the Brooklyn Nets move up, ideally to 3 or 4 rather than 1 or 2. But regardless, I think there's merit to Brooklyn moving up and sending as many of those top talents to the East as possible. That's my general draft lottery preview. Paulo, we don't need to talk about prospects at all because there's no point when we're just a few days away from seeing the order. But in terms of the Nets and any other teams in the lottery, is there anyone else besides the Rockets that you want to see move up or particularly not see move up?
I don't want the Sixers to move down. Basically, I don't see it easy to get the pick. Yeah. And as far as, I typically do this every single draft because I already convinced myself that we're never going to move to number 1. But in this fiction scenario where we do get to move up, I really, really like Harper from Rutgers. I think that's how you pronounce it. And I really think he might be like a Cade Cunningham type of prospect. And considering the series he just went through, a guy like that would be really useful. And I just, if I had to pick my guy, I think he's probably my guy besides the obvious Cooper Fly thing. So yeah, just that going into it. I think my feeling is Rockets get picked too.
Okay. Wow. That is bullish. I like it. Spicy. All right. Well, We'll see how that ages when we record, probably Tuesday, maybe Wednesday of next week. Depending on what happens in the lottery, there might be a greater sense of urgency to record earlier, wink, wink. Hopefully we have a reason to push the envelope. But regardless, we'll do a pod next week reacting to the lottery and also getting to some of the bigger picture post-mortem Warriors series topics that we wanted to get to today, but didn't have time to because, boy, there's just so much to unpack out of this series that we got through maybe 60% of the outline that I gave you earlier today, Paulo, and it's been like an hour and a half. I wanted to keep this show an hour or less. We went to an hour and a half and still didn't even fully get through the outline that I had. So, yeah, let's follow up on the rest next week. We'll see where it takes us. Anyway, that will do it for today's show. And if you want to get in touch with me or Paulo before our next episode, best place to get it is to do that. That is online. I'm on Blue Sky at Ben DuBose. Paulo is on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. And this show is on Twitter/X at The Logger Line. Or if you go to The Logger Line, you can find contributors of this podcast, Apple, Google, and Spotify. Subscribe, leave positive review if you have not already. And also links to friends, partners, sponsors of the program. Carbach Brewing, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Sports Talk 790. Please enjoy their content, and you can help keep us going as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. Everything you can do to make this podcast look good, we would greatly appreciate it. All right, with those plugs complete, we are done for tonight. For Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes of The Logger Line.